about 15 years before I became a minister, I worked in the headquarters of a large international corporation. My title was Manager of Internal Communications, and I supervised a department responsible for creating the media of information that went to all employees. This included everything from publications and periodicals to training videos to notices of benefit changes. Now, all the departments in the company were structured by how they impacted the bottom line. For some reason, accountants couldn't figure out a formula for how internal communications related to profit and loss. It was just information that people had to know. So this left my department constantly threatened by budgetary cutbacks. But even so, I considered the circumstances fortunate, for I found we were bound by neither economic rules nor standard performance expectations, and we could be as creative as we wished in carrying out our responsibilities. And because my staff comprised journalists, photographers, and a video producer, and about half of them were women, it was generally assumed that we operated under different rules than real businessmen. We were granted the dubious distinction of being artists and poets, creative types, and it was not always meant as a compliment. But there were hidden perks in these lack of expectations. One of the complaints I heard from other department managers was that there was a lack of problem-solving abilities among their supervisors. They didn't want their staffs to be too creative, of course. I mean, their work is art and procedures, after all. But how, they asked, might they get their staffs to be more innovative? No, maybe that's too strong. More resourceful. No, that sounds dangerous. How could they get their staffs to improve the bottom line? I took up the challenge and I offered to teach workshops on creativity for middle management. Now, things were obviously worse than I had assumed because my proposal was accepted. One of my models for creativity is children. Children are naturally creative. We listen to them as they play. Let's pretend I'm a this and you're a that, and they are a this and a that. And look at me, I can fly. And they flap their arms, and they know the feeling of flight. Bang, bang, you're dead. And the other player dies on command only to rise and become someone or something else. I mean, you can't get more creative than that. So I told these middle managers that we were going to play, and that they should come dressed for playing. And of course, the men came in suits and ties, and the women came in skirts and high heels. My first task was to get them to remove as much of this protective armor as was reasonable and decent. It was probably the most difficult thing I asked of them all day, and the most productive. I learned a great deal from these participants, and I developed a philosophy and a theology about the importance of creativity to the human spirit. This is what I have come to believe. Each of us, by virtue of being born human, is born a creative creature. Now, not all of us are to become poets, but we are all capable of a fine frenzy, innately, irrevocably. And this innate creativity, being able to imagine, to dream, to build, to overcome, being able to survive or know joy or heal or dream or play, is absolutely necessary for us to be fully human, whole and connected to the universe. It is necessary to our understanding of why this is true. You see, something happens to us between birth and adulthood that often changes our ability to be creative. Our society often subdues our creative urges because creativity, let's face it, is difficult to manage. It can be noisy and disruptive. It can be embarrassing, misunderstood. It can be impolite and out of control. And it almost always encourages change. Perhaps we don't mean to do it, but as we socialize and civilize our children, and believe me, I'm not advocating that we don't socialize and civilize them, but as we do this, we tend to smooth out the rough edges where creativity germinates. Some of us escape the same or rediscover our creative bumps later in life, but many adults actually believe that they are not creative. And when that happens, I think we have misplaced a very important part of ourselves. Now, I tell you that no minister lays down rules of behavior for her congregation or to any congregation before which she speaks. We believe in an individual and free search for truth and meaning, and in assuming responsibility for our own behaviors. But let me tell you this. It pains me to hear anyone who says in my presence, "Oh, I'm not creative. I couldn't do that." I seriously consider it grounds for excommunication proceedings. Because to say it is to make it true, and it is not true. We were born with the ability to be creative, and we may learn to sublimate it, but I think we never lose it. Did you ever hear the story about how they train elephants in India? When the elephant destined for service is a tiny baby, they tie a stout rope to its hind leg and tie the other end of the rope to a large tree. The baby's not strong enough to break the rope or topple the tree, and it soon learns that it cannot get away. As the elephant grows, the rope used for training becomes progressively smaller and lighter, easier for the trainer to handle. And likewise, as the elephant does well in its training, the tree chosen for tethering becomes thinner and younger, with a slighter root system holding it to the earth. Yet, trained adult elephants can be secured to a blade of grass by a string and will be unable to escape. They have learned to believe that they cannot break the rope or pull up the tree, and their mind makes it so. Now, we are enculturated in much the same manner. I'm not saying there are no creative teachers in our school systems and no parents encouraging their children's creativity. I'm not even going to rail against the mind-numbing effects of too much television or too many video games. I'm simply reporting on a social process that tends to filter out our belief in our own creative abilities. In school, we receive a series of behavioral expectations that make the learning process easier. We are rewarded for quiet behavior, good grades, and for obeying authority. And we receive a number of rules. This is the way math is done. Show how you got your answer. This is the proper way to draw a horse. The head always goes in the front, and we'll discuss Picasso later when you can handle it. As the gender and social roles we are given, and pretty soon we can't break the strings that bind us or pull up the grass to which our minds are tied. Fortunately, many of us do overcome our training and discover that there are rules for being creative as well. If you are one of those who are tempted to say, "Oh, I'm not creative, I couldn't do that," I'm here to offer you not excommunication, but salvation. I think that's a fair trade-off, because I'm convinced that even inhibited creativity can be released. One of my favorite creative writers is a man by the name of Roger Van Eck, who writes books with such provocative titles as A Whack on the Side of the Head, subtitled How to Unlock Your Mind for Innovation. His books can be found in the self-help section of the bookstore, but I think they ought to be cross-filed under theology. This is part of one of his sermons, if you will. He wrote, "Most of life presents you with a win-lose proposition. If you don't win, you lose. This is true for most adult games. But when you play freely, as children play, making up the game as they go, a different logic is at work. It is a win-not-win. And when you win, you win. And when you don't, you learn something. The only thing play costs is the time to do it." I like that. When you don't win, you learn something. When we look at children's play in this manner, we realize that much of it is practicing for becoming adults. In play, if you don't get it right, you don't lose. You learn something. You grow. Why did we ever think that we don't need this process as we become adults? deny our ability to create our own lives, our dreams for the future, our ways of looking at our imperfect world. One of my next techniques for unleashing creativity is the game of what if. What if, he asks, we had 7 fingers on each hand instead of 5? And this game isn't going to solve world hunger, but it just might make us more creative so that we can. So play along with me. If we had 7 fingers on each hand instead of 5, would we be able to wave and point at the same time? Would we have 2 finger opposing thumbs? One on either side of the hand. If we did, would we have a better grasp on life? And how would this affect sports? We'd high 7 and we'd say, give me 14. And speaking of numbers, would we have a different numbering system, base 14 instead of base 10? Would piano music be written differently, played differently? What would a keyboard look like? How would our tools be differently designed? Our writing implements? What would we call the other 2 digits? Would obscene gestures proliferate? Would ring sales go up? What would our finger-counting nursery rhymes sound like? Would we also have 7 toes on each foot? And would wide feet be considered more fashionable than they are now? Each question leads us to another, away from the rules, from automatic thinking, toward creativity. It's that easy. Playing what if is only one whack on the side of the head, only one way of freeing ourselves from our assumptions that we aren't creative. But it has its parallels in spiritual disciplines and in religious teachings. When we meditate, we focus on what is within us, as if we were saying, what I see and hear and feel as reality is not the only reality I can know. And when we practice mindfulness, paying attention to every detail and sensation of what we are doing in the moment, it is as if we are asking, what if my roles and my expectations, my hopes and my fears aren't all that important? And the most important aspect of my life is who I am and what I am doing at this very moment. When we use a teaching technique like the Zen koan and ask what appears to be a nonsense question, it is as if we are asking, what if my perception of the world is learned or faulty? And the world is really built of other ways of seeing. You see how creative our creedless Unitarian Universalist faith is that allows us to interpret our own experiences as part of a possible reality, a possible truth? Do you understand how limiting it is not to believe in your own creativity? Do you see how our own fundamentalism is in rejecting old religious stories and previous religious indoctrination can shut us off from seeing new and creative possibilities in our own lives? Now, I know that when I use the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Gospels for a reading, I run a very real risk of alienating or causing pain to a large percentage of this congregation, which is still dealing with having been tethered to its teachings by a psychological string, and that's all it is. Or I risk simply confusing you because you think that such old ideas can only lead to erroneous conclusions. But I invite you for a moment to be creative with me in seeing whether or not there is anything in this or any other literature that can teach us something new. I invite you into a fine frenzy of creativity. I invite you to play with me, to pretend, to loosen your ties and kick off your shoes and to ask, what if? What if I'm right and the old stories and myths are teaching stories and not meant to be taken literally? What would the biblical story of creation mean if it were such a teaching story? What if it were a story not about how you were created, but how you can create? What if? What would it be telling us? Couldn't it be saying that you need to look at what does not exist in your life, at what is dark and where there is a void, and suggesting that something you do could change it? Or to suggest, says the teaching story, is to create. Let there be light, and there was light. All you have to do is believe it. Try it. Let there be love in my life, and if you mean it, love will come in one form or another. Allow there to be happiness, and there will be happiness. Doesn't the story really say that we are the creators of our own lives? Doesn't the story say that when your spirit has created something out of the void and out of the darkness of your life, you must breathe eternal life into that creation by looking at it and saying, that's good? What if the tellers of the story realize that we can kill the very things we create by a critical, harsh judgment of our own puny efforts? What if they knew and were trying to tell us that creating isn't enough? We have to nourish our creations, and then they are very, very good. And says the story, evening came and morning, and it tells us that we can't create everything at once or immediately, but we can build on what we have already created. Let there be an open heart, and the heart is open. And then let love come in to my open heart, and there will be love. And then let love flow out from my heart, and that is a good thing. And then let kindness come from love that flows, that comes from a heart that is open, and it will be very, very good. And evening comes, and morning, and there is time for more creation, and for resting, and for appreciating what you have already created. And says the story's creation was in the image of the Creator, because we create our own lives out of the common materials that we are given, out of clay, out of courage, hope, longing, out of darkness. What could be more common than these materials with which we fashion our living? And what could be more precious? Once we have understood the inspiring message of this story, perhaps it will raise other questions for us. Perhaps it will lead us to other stories. What if, as Joan Borisenko asks in her book, Fire in the Soul, we are fragments of a larger consciousness, an interdependent web of all existence, if you will? What if our uniqueness as individuals doesn't separate us, but is simply proof of our existing toward a common goal? I mean, your liver has a different role from your heart, but each works to keep you alive. What if we are the liver and heart of some larger consciousness? What if we are each essential to the pattern of all creation? What if my life has meaning beyond the confines of my skin? What if the creative intelligence of the universe were perfectly present in each one of us, as the DNA which distinguishes us is encoded in every cell of our body? Then we'd have to live it with attention to and appreciation for the process that is ever unfolding. And what if the larger consciousness knows itself only through the creations of its entities? And what if the purpose of our existence was to become truly loving in order to know that we are part of one existence? And what if I ask myself silly, playful questions that can't be proved in this existence, if they help me to understand myself and my life and to be more creative? And what if my body is simply a spacesuit for my mind and my soul? And what if I have within me all that I need to live, to learn, to be a teacher, a creator? And what if, since almost all of my greatest learning experiences came out of darkness and emptiness, what if pain is also an act of service and a guide that I needn't reject or lament? And what if it takes a whole lifetime to learn everything I need to know and to create everything it is possible for me to create? Shouldn't I start now? So let there be creativity, and there will be creativity. And look, there is no bad thing, only that which I don't understand, and that is good. And look, I am a part of something larger than myself, and that is very, very good. For never again can I be merely human. Please join me in singing our closing.